Good day to you, students. Welcome to this PE tutorial focusing on outdoor education. And look, I've said this on a number of occasions, but if you haven't sort of studied the previous lessons, especially the one on values of PE, I'd really kind of do that first, because I'm going to be relying on some of that information when I present this material to you. But certainly with regard to outdoor education, the first thing I want to stress very clearly, and I wonder if it's been part of it for you personally, but I consider outdoor education to be balanced part of a balanced PE experience at school. So I want you to ask yourself a question about whether you actually took part in outdoor education as part of your school PE experience, or at least and perhaps more a regular part of your school PE experience. And if you didn't, I personally would argue that maybe, perhaps, without meaning to be too sort of critical, that maybe that PE experience hasn't been entirely balanced. Because if we don't experience physical activity, physical challenge in a natural outdoor environment, then it's hard for us to think, well, how can that be a balanced physical experience if it isn't in a natural wilderness-based experience? And really that leads me to my first point. The first part of an outdoor adventurous experience or an outdoor educational experience is, and I will spell it correctly, which is going to help, is it's based in wilderness. Okay, so it is a wild experience. It is not about going on the school playing field and having a game of football. It is about being in the wilderness. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of what those wilderness environments might be. The first one is on the mountain, okay, or on the hill is often the term that's used. Outdoor education happens on the mountainside. It also happens in the water, and by water we mean river, lake, sea, and it can happen in the air. Okay, so these are the wilderness environments in which outdoor education will take place. And as soon as I mention these concepts to you, being in the lake, being on the river, being on the mountainside, as soon as I recognize this, or as soon as I mention this, I hope you're starting to realize that some of the skills that are derived in this outdoor education are going to be greater, broader, more developmental than some of the traditional in-school based physical education experiences. The only thing I'd add on top of that is that we do have sometimes what we'd consider to be an adapted experience. Now, an example of that would be something like a climbing wall, rather than, that might be based in a town or a city or even in your own school, rather than being on the side of a mountain doing some rock climbing. Okay, so we can get adapted experiences of these sorts of environments, but there's something about there's much about being in that natural environment which is developmental and important. Of course, much with our general physical education, there is physical development within outdoor education. There is physical development within outdoor education. And of course, if we think about some of the examples of what outdoor education activities might be, we can sort of see that very clearly. I mean, if I was to give you an example of kayaking or canoeing, as an example, and we've even got an image here of rafting, we see that is a physical experience, a physically challenging experience. But it's not just about that. It could be something like campcraft, learning to camp, learning to pitch a tent, learning to make a fire, learning those survival skills, which, currently are very popular in certain TV shows, watching The Island and Bear Grylls and goodness knows what else. We see a lot of these sort of skills being kind of celebrated, enjoyed, and being a challenge to people. And I guess that brings me on to my other point, because perhaps the other sort of more extreme end of that is even the concept of survival. Now, think about that concept of survival. We have a large number of people in our society that go on to work in the military, for example. Survival can be a central feature of that. So we'd even consider that to be a preparatory skill for that kind of career, should people be choosing to go down that particular route way. We made this point as well within our physical education lesson, but certainly we consider outdoor education to be a very sort of social, interactive experience. We learn cooperation, we learn teamwork, we learn character developing aspects of ourselves, such as leadership or our response to leadership. In fact, I'm going to add straight away the concept of character development. It's very frequently, or outdoor education is very frequently seen as being a pivotal feature of character development, being in the wilderness, being in the natural environment, having the challenge of hunger and the physical challenge and the survival challenge. This is seen very much as character development. And one of the aspects of character that is believed to be developed very centrally through outdoor education is the concept of esteem or confidence or self-worth. These concepts are thought to be brought out by an outdoor adventurous experience. So I've mentioned character development now. I want to make a more general point then, a more general point about what we might describe as personal development. Personal development. Now certainly we would say that what I've written so far about character development would be one facet of that. So let's first of all link those two things together. Character development is certainly one aspect of personal development, but I'd add a couple of additional points. I'd certainly add a term which we used again in our physical education lesson. We talked about self-realization, learning one's strengths, weaknesses, limitations, potentials. These are important processes to go through. Challenge brings that about. I often find that young people don't have enough challenge in their lives. I'm not suggesting that every day should be hard and horrible, but the fact that life can be very comfortable as a young person and there's relatively little challenge maybe isn't actually that good for people, or too much of it. I'm not saying that people shouldn't have security and safety, but maybe sort of a greater level of personal development through challenging experience would be good for people at an early part of their life. And the other point I'd make is about overcoming fears. You might want to think about this in terms of things like heights, fear of water, fear of the cold, fear of being in the natural environment, fear of wild animals. All of these things can be overcome by being in this natural environment. Perhaps that's a really fantastic thing that we want to develop with people. I also want to sort of build on this, the idea of this overcoming fears, the idea of risk. Outdoor education is not in itself a risky experience. Although, when we look at these images, there are certain things there that look a bit risky. The whitewater rafting looks a bit risky, right? But really, it's what we'd call a perceived risk. Okay, so let me put that term in there. It's what we call a perceived rather than a real risk. A perceived risk is where something feels risky but is in fact controlled and safe. Think about rock climbing using harnesses, for example, or high ropes using harnesses. They're good examples of those things. But what that risk does provide us with is that buzz, that adrenaline rush, that, let's put the word in there, that thrill. And that can be something that we can get for outdoor education, but also that thrill, that buzz can actually come just by the challenge of what you've got to achieve. Okay, so I think we've got to add that term in of challenge. Like, I think it's so important for young people, and I don't think there's enough of it for enough young people. I'm sure you are an exception to that, but in general I think more challenge is good for young people, being out of your comfort zone more frequently. One of the other things maybe is not as obvious with regard to outdoor education compared to a lot of sort of sporting PE experiences, is it provides a lot of freedom. You tend to find in outdoor education experiences that people choose. Look at these probably Duke of Edinburgh award students, which I'll mention in a second, out here walking the hill on their own, navigating, meeting the various points on their route that they've got to meet at certain points. They're on their own. They're choosing their path. They're choosing their route. They're planning their route. They're choosing their food. They're setting up camp. They're cooking for themselves. There's a lot of freedom in that sort of experience. And because there's that kind of freedom, we can be really confident that that freedom, a bit like this character development over here, brings about this notion of leadership. So leadership seems to be a central feature of outdoor education experiences. Two more last points that I want to make for you before I sign off on this one. I've mentioned on a number of occasions that outdoor education, being in the natural environment, being connected to one's nature, to one's physical earth environment, is part of it's part of a healthy, balanced lifestyle, a HBL. If we don't do that, we can really consider ourselves to be dislocated from our natural world. Outdoor education can help us to challenge that concept. And the only other point I want to make, and I've mentioned it twice already, is the idea of the DOE, the Duke of Edinburgh Award. Now, many of you will be doing this now, many of you will be doing it in the future, maybe you've done part of it already. The Duke of Edinburgh Award is a internationally recognised qualification of outdoor education, of community involvement, and you have to do weekend walks, for example. You have to develop campcraft. You have to develop leadership. You have to do community projects, and it is a good kind of symbol for outdoor education, especially at a time when fewer and fewer schools are keeping outdoor education as part of their PE curriculum, partly because of risk, partly because of cost, partly because of the expertise of staff maybe not being in this particular area. The Duke of Edinburgh Award can really enable that potential. Oh, the only other thing I said is, of course, that the outdoor education is part of the national curriculum. I should have said that right at the start, so please excuse me for having forgotten to do so. Everyone makes mistakes, hey? Have a great day. Thanks for listening.